Thank you. With that, that was a great presentation, and I think we'll have a lot to talk about in our panel discussion. I wanted to introduce our panel discussion for tonight on that balance of security and our push for innovation using cloud. So with that, I invite our panelists to turn on their videos, and we'll jump into this discussion. So welcome, gentlemen. The best way sometimes to start these conversations is for everyone to really tell us about what you're doing, about yourself and what you're doing in security and your experience in that kind of crossroads between security and government cloud innovation. So with that, Bill, would you like to start with those introductions?
Sure, I'd be great too. Again, thank you for the invite today. Great forum. Actually learned a lot myself already in the Sentinel brief. So have about 28 years in the Air Force, in the DoD space and a little bit in the Intel space. Started as an Intel IT specialist. So it was kind of before we called cyber cool. So that was kind of where I was born, and then went from an intern all the way through the system to the senior IT and cyber professional. Working in things like being a chief technology officer, CIO at the command level, working at the early days of when we're transitioning Intel into cyber. So pretty strong background there. And honestly, kind of walked into cyber as an IT guy. So it was great to grow up in the Intel community under the leadership of folks like General Hayden. So just a little bit short on my background. I think what I'd first start off with in the last couple of years, really some big pivots that we led. Notably around Office 365, I think where the Air Force was a first movement in that direction for the DoD. The first major SaaS deployment with a big CRM platform that we did about 6 years ago. And then working through all the ins and outs of the development and fielding of Cloud One, if you've read that in the trade rag. So big efforts, 700,000 people in our ecosystem making major transitions into cloud. On top of that, from a security perspective, what we started to do is really pivot how we looked at security, and we'll talk about that today. But things like Hack the Air Force and looking at how pen tests and third-party assessments can make sure that we're doing the right things, even though we may not know all the answers going in. And then I also started to pivot around the continuous assessment process, continuous ATO, and the fast track ATO, because I would argue in cloud we have to start thinking differently about how we deliver security in that ecosystem. And so being first out the tranche isn't always the easiest thing from a policy perspective. I know Kenny probably talked to that as well. But I think it started to make the movement of we can trust cloud, but it is a different model. Just like the Sentinel piece, you have to look at this thing from a little bit different perspective. So frankly, now at the Accenture side, having been here about 5 months now, really trying to bring those same capabilities to bear for our customers. In partnerships with the likes of Microsoft and some of the big SaaS providers, making those big movements all the way down to edge cloud and thinking through security and walking people through the security models when it comes to cloud. So I'll pause there.
Karina, I think you're on mute.
I was talking to myself. I thought I had unmuted. So I was to say that was a great introduction, and if Chuck, if you wanted to be next in the round of introductions, that'd be great.
I'm happy. First of all, thank you for inviting me here, and I admire what Bill just said. I think Air Force has really been the leader in not only cloud, but also, especially in cybersecurity over the years, and I've really admired the things they've done. They've been at the forefront. A quick thumbnail sketch of my career. I started out on the Hill, worked 10 years for the late Senator Alan Specter on technology and security issues. Then I moved into a startup called the Department of Homeland Security. I was actually one of the first plank holders there, and helped set up the Science and Technology Directorate and the Office of Legislative Affairs. A very confusing time, and cybersecurity was just a little bit of a thought back then, hardly anything. It was CBRNE, but I followed that path with a passion, went into the industry end, which was first SRA, which is then went public-private, and then to now it's owned by GDIT. Also, it worked at Xerox for Homeland Security, also doing their cloud work, and also most recently, I spent time at General Dynamics Mission Systems as a growth analyst, searching for new technologies. in cybersecurity, including cloud and other emerging technologies. And I retired in January and started my own firm called Brooks Consulting International. I do a lot of cyber work, but mostly actually a lot of branding, marketing, writing, speaking, and I'm also teaching two programs at Georgetown University, one on applied intelligence and the other on cybersecurity risk management. So that's keeping me busy.
Chuck, we see you a lot on the social sphere, so that it's great to have you as a panelist, and we look forward to that conversation. And then invite our last speaker, Kenny, to introduce himself.
So Karina, next time I'd rather go first and not have to follow Chuck and Bill, but let's hear. So my name is Kenny Bowen. I have spent about the last 20 years in government, both predominantly DoD, about half and half between DoD and the IC. Most recently, my most recent government job was I stood up the Chief Information Officer for Special Programs Office to kind of cut across a really nostalgic and entrenched group of the Department of Defense. The best way to kind of think of these folks, if you haven't experienced them, as probably the most highly regulated folks, and you know, they're very air-gapped is probably the best articulation for here. My primary focus and really passion there was really modernization. Cloud really became the cornerstone of what we were doing there. Probably some of the more sophisticated ABAC work that exists. I will say that there's, you know, lots of opportunity for the government to learn from commercial best practices. I would say that ABAC is actually one of the areas where the government is really maybe a little more sophisticated when you think of the scale and complexity of how that's implemented. So we spent a lot of time working that nexus. A lot of focus on the industrial base. You know, the government people have a hard time remembering how bad it is when you're in the DIB, when you don't get to be connected to things like SIPRNet and JWICS and some of those other more common networks. So I really kind of have a pretty good passion and a lot of focus with the industrial based partners who really make up a large percentage of what the Department of Defense does. Today in Azure engineering, so you know what we're focused on in Azure engineering is really making sure that the infrastructures we bring to market are there to accommodate the highly regulated and highly regulated customers. And what I think the world is starting to see is that some of the practices that the highly regulated classified community has done really have applicability all the way into the pure public sector, right? Data tagging, zero trust, a lot of the premises we've heard today. So, Karina, appreciate the opportunity to be here and look forward to the questions.
Well, I think we have a powerhouse panel tonight, so thank you for your time. I think, Kenny, you really teed up the next question on trends. So this is, I think we'll start with Chuck. What are the trends in security practices, and what are those trends, and how are we keeping pace with the innovation in cloud?
Oh, great. Well, the good part is I just heard two great presentations from TJ and Seth on some of those capabilities and some emerging technologies and what they're doing with those trends. I think the biggest trend of all is that people are now looking to bake security in all aspects, in the tools and the policies, the processes, and in the organizations themselves. That's a really big trend, and it's also a wake-up call for a lot of in the industry. But I think you have to look at some of the challenges too, which sort of gear right into the trends. And some of the new challenges, of course, is remote work, lack of best practices, not so much in government because of the regulations, but with a lot of the vendors and supply chains, the transitions of the large data from workloads now going to the cloud. And of course, there's the basics of cloud security, you know, access control. A lot of people don't understand that, and you have to look also at insider threats and accidental exposure, ransomware, and a whole lot of other threats that are coming up, and not least of all, Internet of Things, of all the access to unauthorized and authorized devices. So how do you deal with that? I think there's three pillars that was also commented on by Steph and TJ, and it's really automation, identity and access management, and zero trust. And I think those components, back with now with the fact of machine learning coming into play and being more advanced, heading towards eventually towards artificial intelligence, has brought in a new era of analytics and new capabilities to look at statistical inferences, detect anomalies, etc. So I put together really just a quick list, what I think are some of the areas of innovation, and I'll read through them really quickly because I know we're short on time. We have a lot of great things to say. So the trends that I see are the stakeholder information sharing, which is happening to catalyze innovation, mentioning that compliance reporting tools, inter-cloud orchestration, because you're dealing with a lot of multi-cloud, a better encryption, going to a higher grade of military encryption and some of the data in motion and at rest, micro-segmentation, so it's not so easier for breaches to expand into the network. Of course, the zero trust network and digital rights management key, and the cloud testing tools and services, which is a whole new area that's getting a lot of attention and investment, and including cloud access security brokers. And then again, the most important thing where I see a lot, and what I gather from Steph's and TJ's presentation, identity and access management, which I really think is the key to keeping your security and innovation safe. And there's a lot of ML that's going into that, and I see that you have to always adapt to the changing environment and threats.
Great. So we talked a lot about risk management and kind of those trends. So how are we rethinking that risk management? When we talk about cloud, how are we accepting risk in a cloud environment? Bill, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Absolutely. So I'll kind of start with two kind of precursors. Used to work for General Hyten when he was the commander of Space Command. And he really fundamentally understood, even in the space business, which is a zero fail mission, he understood what risk management was. And then secondly, I took over basically the Air Force HR CIO job right after the OPM breach. So it was kind of like, okay, that was a really good job decision, right? To take over a CIO job after the OPM breach. But those two things together really came in, because when I would come in as a CIO every day into the personnel process systems, which we had about 200 systems, we judged our security by compliance. We judged it by whether our paperwork was done. We judged it by these very, very much these things that didn't really matter. In fact, I would say the adversary likes us to be burdened down by the paper. And so what it really brought to me was the early stages of thinking through risk management, thinking of the dimensions of risk. And frankly, when you talk about cloud, because again, we moved that big HR system to the cloud about 6 years ago, I started to change the dimension around the old versus the new. In the case at that time, we were running the first version of Java. We had a very holy, but not in a religious sense, system. And we were moving to a hardened IL4 cloud environment, right? And so I said, take a step back. We're going to work through the compliance steps, but we are going to move there with agility and speed and maneuver, because frankly, the adversary wants us to keep that HR system on that antiquated old system. And we can't wait 6 months, 12 months, 18 months before we move. And so I know we'll talk about some of the dimensions of how we look at the risk a little bit later, but that was really the changing point, to get people to think holistically about risk in the context of what risk they're taking today. Because frankly, we all know we can't get to 100% compliance, but what we can do is every day when we come in, understand the posture that we have, continue to harden. And I would argue cloud with the resiliency, the ability to harden images, containerization and segmentation, all of those features are game changing. And so the last thing we want to do is stay on an antiquated old platform. And so I give you those two precursors to go. One, it takes leadership to give you the top cover, right? You got to have that piece behind you, but it also takes the thought leadership to think about the problem a little bit differently. And what you're really aiming at isn't compliance and paperwork. It's actually hardening the systems underneath the hood.
Great. And Kenny, I know you've, Bill's mentioning accreditation, that whole process. I know you have some experience in that. How's that cloud making it better or worse?
So I think it's doing exactly what you said. It is definitely making it better and worse at the same time. But I see a lot of promise and opportunity there. In my last, one of my last roles, we spent a lot of time and energy working on bringing cloud in for the really highly regulated customers. And we were really bullish about onboarding. And, when we went through that, and we did a really good job, one of the former CIOs kind of described it as snow plowing through a series of speed bumps, polishing the road, tipping at a 45-degree angle, and trying to make cloud as easy as possible. And the team worked through, contracting and finance and accreditations on the infrastructure. But what the team really missed was the end workload accreditation. And, the legacy business processes, back to what Bill was saying, where there's a really big focus on compliance, left a lot of workloads in cloud that were really on the 1 yard line. So, as we looked at that and said, all right, in hindsight, what could we have done better? What could we have done different? What advice would we have for people who are going through that journey today? There's really three things that I think come to mind for me. And they're all really of the same theme here. The first is plagiarism, right? Aaron Weiss, who's the CIO of the Navy, he's just religious about this, right? We're all very special, but we're not really that different, right? Don't be afraid to reuse things that your trusted brothers and sisters and cousins have done. So really embrace work that has been done in other places that's already been trusted. The second is, as you're building new work, really have a bias towards reuse, right? Be thoughtful about how you can leave it and make it available. One of the really clever things that one of our sharp engineers did is every time, literally every time we would onboard a new customer and we would build for them, we would publish that work, right, out to repos to allow other people to just not have to start from there again. So, consume other people's work, be aggressive about sharing your work. And then it really goes back to the reciprocity word, which I know is really a philosophical approach, but people really think of reciprocity. I think it's too extreme, right? It's really easy to be reciprocal in your in sharing your assessment work, but people, authorizing officials, I think Bill would probably echo this, right? Risk isn't the same in two places. You still have to make a decision tactically, but as much as you can embrace and reciprocally accept the assessment phase, the 3PAO work that others have done, and then apply that to your environment, I think that really will help people move to mission faster. So at the end of the day, plagiarize as much as you can. Be willing to publish back for other people to plagiarize, and then reciprocity really does have a place, especially in cloud, especially with automation, especially when we can come in and empirically prove, right, that what someone else did and what you got really are the same.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that really resonates. In Microsoft, as a hyperscale cloud provider, we're thinking a lot about automation and where we can provide those opportunities of reuse for the industry at large. And I would imagine everybody in our ecosystem, I know ACT-IAC and other there's a lot of working groups around how we can facilitate the accreditation process in that vein of freeing up innovation. A lot of that discussion is really around DevSecops. And so it'd be interesting, I don't know, Chuck, if you're thinking about DevSecOps, like what really needs to occur to ensure security is appropriately built into these new technologies, new applications, without slowing down that speed to innovation. I know this is a topic dear to my heart, so I'm very interested to hear kind of what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. Well, DevOps is still one of the biggest challenges. Is 85% of the attacks are on applications. So the big issue is, again, I think it comes down to collaboration and information sharing as the basis. There's no real ultimate solution for DevOps, but you can produce more secure products, and you can produce more secure products by learning lessons of others and how they did it, how they detect the unknowns, the knowns, and other variables. And of course, you want to dedicate this app security towards zero-day vulnerabilities if possible. So the elements again go back to what both Bill and Kenny said. It's risk management, and you have to sort of figure where you're going to put your efforts. And it starts, I think, from left to right now, starting with the policy of risk management, looking where you're going to go, and then you have to look at every part of the supply chain, the life cycle, and that's inception, design, the build, the test, the release, support, maintenance, and anything beyond that, because it's always going to be adapting. The challenges and the threats are adapting, so it's never a static issue. And with DevOps, that's very difficult. Plus, there's not any real ultimate standards. I mean, there is with the intelligence community, but not with throughout government. And I think it's a challenge. And I think so. We could be open more with information sharing, particularly from the classified community. I think it would be very helpful for ensuring DevOps security. I know DHS embarked on something a few years back to do this information sharing capacity, largely from the private sector, which has very good experiences too. But it's a big challenge.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're seeing in DoD several software factories pop up, and a lot of discussion around Devsecops, moving security to the left earlier in the application development process. Bill, I know you've worked a lot in this space in DoD, but also in your new role at Accenture Federal. What are your thoughts on Devsecops and the impact of maybe taking the friction out of that end of the process so that we can get that speed to innovation? Right.
I would at first say, we've talked for years about baking, the proverbial baking security in, and frankly, we never did it. I think the one pivot, if there was anything else of the DevSecOps movement, was truly moving that left of bang and actually building it into the model, whether that's two-person integrity when you're doing code, whether you're doing code reviews, actually baked in through the process. All the new tools that are coming out that you can actually do that in the software development process. We actually started to action those. I think all of the software factories, first and foremost, have been thinking that way as they've done development now across all the services. So frankly, that was the biggest thing. So when we published our continuous ATO memo and policy, that was really the foundation, is realize that, again, we were doing ATOs at the very end for the most part. We're doing a little bit before, but most of it was at the end. And so moving it forward, this is also where our hack the, Astra came in with DIU and Air Force and other entities of like, let's, no kidding, also self-assess. So part of that policy was self-assess and get third-party assessment to come in and give an independent review, not 3 years from now after it's too late, but actually in these quarterly or semi-annual kind of. So that outside view was really key, but it was really about truly actioning continuous development, monitoring, defense, not waiting till the end of it. And so now you've got policy coming out, you've got it baked into the DoD instructions, you've got it baked into these software factories. There's still work to do. I think we all know software is still a little mushy when it comes to security, but I would argue we have fundamentally made it 1,000 times better than it was, 5 years ago or even 3 years ago. And we just have to keep maturing that view. And so even things like the Sentinel piece, the monitoring of the cloud, the monitoring of the software applications, those tools have been maturing as well. You start laying the AI layers on top of that. I think we're really starting to progress into the next generation of software code inside the DoD.
Let's talk about a little bit about kind of change management, or how do you incent a workforce? And Kenny, we didn't talk about this, but your background and how many apps you're able to move to a cloud was pretty impressive when we had that conversation. How were you able to do that? Like, was there a lot of education around kind of how to move to cloud while still remaining secure, especially in your line of work, which was special access program, which is probably the most, secure kind of scenario. Can you tell us a little bit more about that experience?
Sure. I want to just, if I could real quick, I want to foot stomp what Bill said. I couldn't agree more with his characterization that we always talk about doing security at the beginning, but the reality was, and I think anybody who's spent any, more than a few years as an authorizing official would attest that you typically get asked to make the risk decision when all of the money is spent, The system is behind schedule, and somebody needed it yesterday. And then you get to manage risk, right? And that's just, not where you want to be doing it. I do think that the DevSecOps thing is really, really giving us the opportunity to move that way left. But if we kind of merge these two things together, I don't think I can emphasize enough the people piece of this. Global shortage in every market for every reason of cyber professionals, that is absolutely the case. But what I would say is simplicity. There is an elegance in simplicity, and that taking an incredibly sophisticated approach is really probably counterproductive, right? So you have to balance. One of our key tenets in really all of the major projects I ran was this decision on the onset. Is this a technology project or is this a culture project? Because if you try to change both technology and culture at the same time, especially in highly regulated areas, you usually end up with more antibodies and friction than you can overcome. So as the government migrates to cloud, and the commercial cloud service providers have so many features and so much technology out there, the simpler the implementation, especially when you got started, the more successful people were. Because again, you've got multiple tribes that you have, constituents you have to convince along the way. Even if you find the most whiz-bang brilliant developer to build your thing, you got to get it through accreditation. They're not gonna stick around with you forever. You're gonna have to hand that off to someone else to sustain. So really being thoughtful about simplicity throughout the entirety of the workforce is probably one of our biggest lessons learned. Phil, what did you experience?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, especially in the cybersecurity space. I mean, the proverbial. I mean, this is again, tools can help simplify, but don't believe tools are the only answer to it. That the human still has to consume and act on these things. So I absolutely agree with you. I mean, and frankly, we all know we used to build these ecosystems from the ground up. Every time you did that, it was ripe for the wrong things to be done, the wrong configurations to be. And so when you talk about cloud, the ability to repeat hardened images, provide a very resilient infrastructure. As Chuck mentioned, a lot of those trends are actually being played out in the industry right now to improve, I'll call it the blast radius of when something does happen. And so I would argue speed and maneuver these days is so much more important than lethargy, compliance, those kind of things, because you get so much when you move to cloud. And then you can start to really accelerate your game and really focus on the application side. It used to be, and again, I'll go back to like OPM, it was all about core hygiene, right? Complex, legacy, antiquated, very large. With cloud, you get the repeatability, you get the secure hardening, you get all of these abilities baked in from the ground up, and then you can really just focus on that application. So I wanted to give those thoughts because I think they're really important to your simplicity discussion, but they provide such powerful capabilities for a simple investment.
Well, I think what comes to mind when we're looking at cloud adoption is the shared responsibility model. Outsourcing infrastructure services doesn't really mean that the risk is outsourced. So given that, in government, how is that working in practice? Just kind of a follow-up of what we were talking about. How is that shared risk working?
So I know Kenny probably experienced some of this with the DoD implemented a program called CVR, which was basically Office 365 or cloud collaboration during COVID. And a couple things when you talk about shared responsibility, right? There's a lot of, again, functionality with data loss prevention and other things like that that are really just baked into the product. So in this case, Microsoft really has some core capabilities there. But at the same token, the DoD wants to be able to take those feeds, take the sensor data, be able to aggregate across a larger domain and understand the larger threats. And so the shared responsibility is how do you take the best of the cloud provider, in this case, Microsoft, and the operational kind of focus of our cyber airmen, women across the DoD, and merge the sensor feeds, merge the data together, start to get holistic views of what's going on. And so I think when you talk about shared responsibility, you get the repeatability and scalability of cloud. You get that ability to quickly discover and remediate with the provider. And then you start to be able to leverage those tools and data to start doing advanced analytics on what proverbially the bad guys are doing. So I kind of call it the 1 + 1 = 4, is if you leverage commercial right and you leverage your own ingest of the data and the sensor data, again, a perfect feed in from Sentinel, I wasn't completely planned, but then you start to really give the true enabler for a new world model that I think accelerate both our games, both on the industry side and the government side.
And any thoughts from any of the other speakers?
I totally agree with what you said. I mean, I think also the trend now in industry, and that's particularly with the critical infrastructure protection, is much deeper cooperation with the government side. I think that's been lacking for a lot of the past decades, and I think you're seeing a major transformation in the last few years in that. And I think it's a mutual recognition of capabilities, and that the private sector and the public sector need each other, and particularly to meet the shortages of workforce and be able to orchestrate and automate. I think it's a winning solution.
So being mindful of time, we have about 6 minutes left. If we're looking to the future, what does cloud security landscape look like in 5 years? And anyone, I don't know, Chuck, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to what the trends are saying. I think it's going to be a lot more automated. I think it's going to be eventually based on artificial intelligence. The human element will oversee, but be less of a human element. And I think all the elements of security will again be built in through tools and processes up front. It'll be probably self-healing. That's one of the areas that's being focused on. But it's going to be we're in a new era and it's a transformational era, exponentially changing technology and computational power and data analytics. So all that's going to factor in.
Well, how about from like the government side? We're seeing these massive procurements and push and sponsorship of moving to cloud. How are we seeing that influence that security space in the DoD or federal at large?
Well, I can tell you from an Accenture perspective, I mean, our CEO, Julie Sweet, just recently, the Cloud First initiative, very empowering, but most importantly, in the business side of it, that security aspect is so fundamental. So we are absolutely all in on it, and it's because we do see it as a game changer also from a security perspective. Chuck hit it out of the ballpark. I mean, all the analytics we can start to do for our customers, I mean, starts to really change the game. And again, I kind of go back to, how we judge risk when I, first became an SES in the Air Force was about compliance and paperwork. And starting to see, I think those risk algorithms and the decision matrix and those kind of things that can be better AI enabled. So every day when I come in, I know whether I'm better, the same, or worse than I was yesterday, and then be able to quickly action through automatable, if that's a word, playlists and playbooks, and taking that sensor data just on a continuous basis to respond. Because just like in warfighting, cyber is about maneuverability. It is about hardening and about defending, but it's oftentimes about maneuverability and outmaneuvering the adversary. So I think these tools are going to allow us to move workload, to outmaneuver the bad guy and hide in the dark and do all the kind of warfighting tactics that we do kinetically, start doing them with full robustness non-kinetically.
So I think if we really think about the space, we're still at early days in cloud adoption. So for those who perhaps are more in the accreditation space and they're new to risk management, new to shared responsibility matrix, and new to cloud, what's like one piece of advice you'd like to share with those folks as they kind of get into that move to cloud and trying to balance kind of the old ways or the traditional ways of looking at security? So what's that one kind of parting piece of advice? And I'll start with Kenny.
Rodney Dangerfield answer. One answer, 3 parts. I don't think you can invest in your people enough. Just get started, right? But keep it simple, right? That would probably be my best advice.
Bill?
Speed matters. And I found very few instances in our business where modernization wasn't more secure than the legacy platforms, especially in the DoD. So the quicker you accelerate, you adopt, and you move, I think you'll be in a better risk position. And so it's not always intuitive in a highly regulated organization, but speed matters. Use it to your advantage, not your disadvantage.
That's great advice. Chuck?
I would say learn from the best practices of others. There's a lot of case studies out there. There's a lot of experience out there from other companies and organizations, and it's often shared publicly, even on places like LinkedIn. You can learn a lot just by reading and looking where the trends are going.
Well, with that, I want to thank you for a great discussion. And actually, I think you teed up our next meetup on open source and Devsecops. So where we're going to talk about reuse and kind of what are the depots out there we should be looking at. But with that, I want to thank you very much for your time tonight, and thank you everybody who's tuning in. We had a great registration and response from the community. We look forward to having everybody back together December 2nd for our last meetup of the year. So with that, thank you everyone, and have a good night. It's hashtag Azure Gov Meetup, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karina.
Thanks, Karina.
Thanks, Karina.